Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, good afternoon. Please join in welcoming our guest speakers, David and Julie Eisenhower, accompanied by their good friend Ben Stein. Thank you, and our thanks to that great Villa Park High School jazz concert band led by Chuck J. Chuck and young performers, we appreciate every time you're here. You're great entertainment, and sometime we're going to do a concert just with you up here and nobody else, okay? Thank you. You're a great addition. Ladies and gentlemen, please stand for the presentation of the colors, followed by the Pledge of Allegiance. Please stand.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Please say thanks to the Gulf Command 23rd Marine Battalion Color Guard. Please be seated, and to this 18-year-old U.S. Naval Sea Cadet, Brian Ely, who led the Pledge of Allegiance from Edison High School. We just concluded our annual Board of Directors meeting. We have a lot of these people present. I want them to stand because they'll eventually approve my salaries. Please stand, our Board of Directors. Please stand. Also, among them is the President's brother, Ed Nixon. Please stand again. You'd never ever know he's the brother, would you? When he turns sideways, I call him Mr. President. And his sister-in-law, Clara Jane Nixon. Thank you, Clara Jane, for coming. Please stand. Now, down to a little housekeeping and business. The question, how many of you are members of our President's Council, our Cabinet, or our Associates Club? Please raise your hand. Well, thank you, those of you who raised your hand. Those of you who didn't, shame on you. You can fill this form out, which is available to you at the desk in the lobby, and you can become a member. Please join us. Please help enable us to tell the life and legacy of the 37th President. And if you do today, there's something, we have a deal. You sign up today, and you can do so for as little as $50, or if you're in a real good mood today, you can go to $5,000. We're going to give you, free of charge, along with your membership, this attractive new mug, now available in our gift shop, What Would Nixon Do? Now, I'm sure it's $100 or $150 on eBay. You can have it free if you'll sign up today. And when you do sign up, you'll find that you'll get all our notices, our announcements, our special gift shop offers, and you'll hear about great speakers well in advance of the public announcement, and you'll be able to get tickets at a substantially reduced price. For example, our next speaker is Governor Mike Huckabee, coming on November 28th in the evening at 8 o'clock, followed by Edmund Morris, who many of you may know as the Pulitzer Prize winning author of the series, the trilogy on Theodore Teddy Roosevelt, coming here for his next huge big seller, Colonel Roosevelt, and that's on November 28th. Our biggest event, which closes out our year, 2010, will be in this very room, the East Room, when we honor two-time Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld and his wife Joyce, accompanied by our special guest, Vice President and Lynn Cheney, who will speak on that night on December 6th. Now, those tickets are a little more because it's a fundraiser. So those of you who support the good work that we do, please sign up and become a member and come to our events. And if you find it in your heart, come December 6th for a spectacular evening gala in honor of Secretary Rumsfeld. We gather really today, as we do every year, and we've done so for 20 years, to commemorate Veterans Day. And every year in this very room, we have a spectacular event where we pay tribute to veterans, one of whom, of course, was Richard Nixon, who was in the South Pacific as a young naval officer during World War II. Today, we honor President Eisenhower, General Eisenhower, for his extraordinary career in the military and his efforts, his successful efforts at Normandy to win freedom for the world. So that's why we gather today. We're honored to have to speak today General President Eisenhower's grandson, David, and his wife, Julie, the daughter of President and Mrs. Nixon, here to officially launch their new book, Going Home to Glory. And to introduce them today, we have their longtime good friend and ours, Ben Stein. Ben Stein has an amazing biography. Go on Google and read it. It is amazing. His father, of course, was in the administration, as was he. In the Nixon administration, he was speechwriter and lawyer. He graduated in economics from Columbia. He graduated from the Yale Law School. He's a writer, a constant writer. You read him in the New York Times. You've seen him in New York Magazine, in LA Magazine, in American Spectator, E! Online, etc., etc. He's a commentator on CBS Sunday Morning and on Fox News, and of course you all know him from his very popular Win Ben Stein. Did anybody win Ben Stein's money? Did anybody win it? Did anybody win it? No, that's why he arrived in a limousine today. He's written 30 books, 30 books. But most important to many of us, and particularly me, is his role as the bored teacher in my favorite movie, Ferris Bueller's Day Off. And I guess yours too. That movie was recently ranked as one of the 50 most famous films in American history. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce Ben Stein.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I greatly salute the veterans and the people in the armed services who are still in uniform. I've introduced in many different ways. As a very good friend of Julie and David Eisenhower is about the best introduction I can think of. They have been great friends through thick and thin, and as I told Julie and David, I think their next venture should be in skincare products, because I've known them since 1973 and they don't look one day older than they did then. Something's going on here. Today is Veterans Day. We remember the men and women who fought our wars, every single one of them in every single war and every single battle. They, not the actors and actresses who live a few dozen miles west of here, are the stars that keep America bright, and the battles they fought and still fight are what determine man's fate. Of all the battles Americans have ever fought, we as a nation have never fought a bigger war than the invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe, one of the great military ventures of all time, certainly one of the very most consequential because of its dramatic effect on victory in Europe and because of its meaning in keeping the major countries of Western Europe free of communism after VE Day. The key figure in that campaign was the Anglo-American fighting man. But of all of these, the key man was Dwight David Eisenhower. David has chronicled this period spectacularly already, and it's a classic of history and biography. Rightly a hero for the ages for leading what he rightly called the crusade in Europe, General Eisenhower went on to become one of the great presidents of American history. Peace, progress, and prosperity was the Republican slogan in 1956, and it was a great summary of the nation that Eisenhower led from 1953 to 1961. He kept us out of war when war would have seemed inevitable. He kept a tight lid on government spending and government deficits were either nil or tiny on his watch. By the way, the last Republican president who had a budget surplus was Richard Nixon. Anyway, most of all, he managed the nation as we made a U-turn from one of the most explicitly racist nations on earth in 1954 towards integration and racial equality after 1954. This was a turbulent time in which deep passions were ignited that could have led to real national catastrophe. The fact that the nation made the change fairly smoothly is what I believe to be miraculously subtle and strong moral leadership by President Eisenhower. Other leaders talked the talk, Ike walked the walk. It's interesting. I was just on CNN with Larry King, a good friend of Julie and David's, and someone was saying, well, is President Obama a better campaigner or a better president? And one of the commentators on the show said, well, of course he's a better campaigner, because all you have to do when you're a campaigner is talk, and when you're president, you have to actually do something. But this is not a knock on President Obama. It's true of everything. But other leaders talked the talk. Ike walked the walk. He didn't just talk about getting things done. He got them done without hype, without dramatics, without grandstanding. And he left us in 1961 a nation in better shape in many ways than it would ever be again. But what did President Eisenhower, General Eisenhower as he wanted to be called after he left office, what did he do after he left office? That's what David and Julie's book that we're talking about today is about. It's a biography and a memoir of what a beloved general and statesman did when he left office, how he appeared to his extremely, phenomenally attentive grandson, and what he was like as a man, elder statesman, husband, father, grandfather, and human being. No man is a hero to his valet, says the famous quote. But while Ike was a hero to David and to the whole world, David and Julie do us the great biographical service of letting us in on some ways in which Dwight Eisenhower was more of a suburban dad and granddad, more like Ozzie Nelson, than a five-star general. His fussiness about his routine, his taste in literature. He famously loved Westerns, everyone knows that, but only those with no women in them. His obsession with bridge, and even his own embarrassment about not playing a hand perfectly. It is fascinating to see how Ike worked with such extraordinary gentlemanly restraint to affect policy, but in a way above party and personalities. I won't tell you any more about the book, and this is David and Julie's show. Let's just say this is a serious book, and the fact that it has some hilarious moments, I mean, genuinely laugh out loud moments, as in how President Eisenhower dealt with flattery, makes it all the more serious. This is a portrait in full of a man and a hero in full. This was an uplifting book to read because it described a genuinely great man. But it was also, to me, a disturbing book, because we really don't seem to have many men or women of Ike's moral character and self-discipline on the scene right now. He is a man made of greater stuff than we seem to have now, from greater times than we have now. Perhaps we can use this book as a yardstick to measure present and future national leaders. If we do, I'm afraid they're going to look pretty puny. Our sad loss, but what a gift to have had General Eisenhower. Now may I introduce you to two great friends and great biographers, David and Julie Eisenhower.
Great. Thank you. Okay.
You have water?
No. It's down there. It is so wonderful to be back in Yorba Linda and to be here with so many special friends, with my uncle and my aunt and Ron Walker, Sandy Quinn, my beloved honorary sister Maureen Nunn, and also to have Carl Anthony here with us. He is the foremost historian on First Ladies, and when Dave teaches his class at University of Pennsylvania, Carl Anthony's the first one that those doing projects on First Ladies consult. But most of all, I mean, aren't we lucky in many things in life, but to have somebody like Ben Stein as a friend? He's the best. Through thick and thin, and we loved his parents, Mildred and Herb Stein. And when we signed our book to Ben, when we sent him a copy, an early copy, when we knew that he was going to be able to come to Yorba Linda and do the introduction, we inscribed it in memory of Herb and Mildred, because they were in the Nixon administration. They were part of the whole group of extraordinary men and women who served the country so well in those years. And I think they represent so many great qualities about this country. As Ben said, and as Sandy said so eloquently, it is Veterans Day, and so David and I would like to dedicate our talks to all the men and women serving today who make us so proud to be Americans every day. Of course, you know that Eisenhower and Nixon were wartime presidents. When Ike was elected in '52, America was at war in Korea. When my father was elected in 1968, we were deeply at war with Vietnam. More than 500,000, 550,000 young men were fighting in Vietnam when my father took office. And believe me, not one day went by during my father's presidency until the war ended in January of 1973 that my family didn't think of the troops and didn't think of the 591 POWs who were suffering in North Vietnam and who my father refused to abandon. I think that you can understand why one of the most moving things that has happened to me since my father left the presidency was to meet a former POW from San Diego a few years ago. And he told me that whenever they had their reunions, that he and his comrades, quote, "We always set a place at the table for your dad." Now, the book that we present today, Going Home to Glory, is about five-star General Dwight D. Eisenhower. And this is an individual who knew better than anyone the pain and agony of sending men into battle. And I think one of the most moving stories in the book is how in 1963, Ike went back to Normandy to meet Walter Cronkite and to recapture D-Day 20 years later. And he was getting ready to go out there to the American cemetery overlooking Omaha Beach. You know the scene. row after row of markers and crosses. And he told CBS producer Fred Friendly, you know, tomorrow I've got to go out there and speak to these families who lost sons and husbands and fathers at Normandy. I who came out of the war with enough glory to carry me on to other things. And he was agitated, he was humbled. And somehow, though, in the morning when he did go back to those beaches, this is what he said, and I think he captured it well. He said, "I devoutly hope that we will never again have to see scenes such as these. These young men gave us a chance, and they bought time for us so that we could do better than we've done before." So any day I think about that day 20 years ago now, I say once more, we must find some way to work to gain an eternal peace for this world. Those are the words of Dwight Eisenhower. He was an incredible figure, and that's why I'm so glad that I had an opportunity to work with David on this book. And we've had a partnership and a marriage for 41 years, but I have to say that the highlight so far has been the opportunity to do this book together. So I feel a little bit sentimental being here at the Nixon Library because, you know, this is the community that gave my father the chance to serve. That committee of 100 that picked Richard Nixon, still in his Navy uniform, in 1946 to run against an incumbent. Does it sound familiar? Kind of almost a Tea Party feel in the sense that people were, at the end of the war, they were fed up, they wanted to change, they wanted new people. Richard Nixon was in that class. And the reason I, say I feel sentimental being here and the book is that, let's face it, David and I are together because of that little magical pinch of politics that was sprinkled over our lives. And we were 8 years old when we met. It was the 1957 inauguration of Dwight Eisenhower and Richard Nixon. And there are even photos of us taken that day to prove that we were there. There's a picture of David staring at me because I had a great big black eye. I had been in a sledding accident a week before. There had been a big snow in Washington. I was out sledding, and I lost control of my sled, and I went into a tree. So I really had a beautiful shiner. So when the photographers gathered at that inaugural parade to take a photograph of the president and his grandchildren with his vice president and Tricia and me, President Eisenhower leaned down to me and he whispered, "Now, Julie, you look this way, and they won't see your black eye." So I looked this way. I saw an extremely cute 8-year-old, and they took the pictures, and when David and I were engaged 10 years later, President Eisenhower gave me a framed copy of that photo, and here's what he inscribed on it: "To Julie Nixon, who even then unknowingly seems to have gained an admirer." But it really wasn't until we went off to colleges near each other that we got together. And that was because Mamie Eisenhower finally wore her grandson down. "You've got to look Julie up." So David came over to call on me at Smith College, and he took me out for a dish of ice cream, discovered he'd spent all his money on the cab ride over. I had to pay for his chocolate and my strawberry. And so then a week later, he got up his courage to come back, and he had one of those experiences that almost derailed the romance. David recalls that even he felt a little bit sheepish when he presented himself to the young woman on duty in my dorm and said, "Hello, I'm David Eisenhower, and I would like to see Julie Nixon." And the girl gave him a long look, and she said, "Yeah, and I'm Harry Truman." Yeah? Right. By the way, we've been fighting all week about who gets to tell that story. It's okay. But Dave persisted, and so here we are in Yorba Linda today to present Going Home to Glory. It's several things, this book. It's a history of the 60s, it's a story about a grandfather and a grandson, and it's also, I think, a fascinating look at how a president, who is the most powerful figure in the world, because the American president is still that figure, how do you surrender power? How do you do it gracefully? How do you grow old gracefully? Well, that's what we're writing about. What I decided to do today was to just share with you just a tiny bit of Ike's wisdom, because, you know, he just wasn't shy about sharing his little maxims on life with his grandson or with me or any of the young people he came into contact with. So I had fun gathering 4 of Ike's lessons on life, I call them. And as you listen to them, I think you'll agree that they are great lessons on life, but they're also good for relationships and partnerships. And after all, Ike and Mamie were married for 52 years. Okay, first lesson from Ike: stand firm and stand for something. Have principles. He called them the building blocks of character: hard work, worthy ambition, common sense, integrity, and moral courage. And here's the example of Dwight Eisenhower standing firm in Going Home from Glory. 2 weeks before David and I got married, Ike, from his hospital bed at Walter Reed, offered David $100 if he would cut his mop of curly hair for our wedding. Now, I have to tell you, $100 is a lot of money in 1968. Well, Dave did get a light trim, but it wasn't short enough for Ike, and he didn't pay. Stand firm. Okay. Second principle of life from Ike: grin and fight. Eisenhower boxed at West Point. He was also an all-American football player. He was a great athlete. And in his political life, he often used metaphors about boxing to talk to his supporters. He also talked to Dave through boxing. He liked to tell the story of an encounter at West Point with a very fine boxer who was actually 40 pounds heavier. And Ike describes how he got knocked down and kept getting knocked down and staggered back up, and finally, in Ike's words, he looked kind of rueful. Well, his opponent took off his gloves, threw them in the corner, and said, "Well, I'm done boxing with you." And so Ike asked why, and the boxer said, "If you can't smile when you get up from a knockdown, you're never going to lick an opponent." Now, Eisenhower made that lesson part of his life, telling Republican supporters, if you see someone irritating you, just grin. Once in a while in life, he continued, when they throw a haymaker at you, so what? You don't win a campaign in one battle. You win a campaign by sticking everlastingly to it. Grin and fight. Eisenhower of lesson number 3 on life: forgive. Forgiveness is one of the most powerful forces in life. In Going Home to Glory, David describes a summer that he turned 13, and he was hired to work on his grandfather's farm. He had the great job of painting the fences, weeding the vegetables. He also had a 2-day-a-week job at Gettysburg College, and he was much more interested in that job. You know, he was a teenager. And he admits that he had several lapses of concentration when he was working on the farm. He recalls particularly one lunch hour when he and a friend kept playing Honeymoon Bridge in the small den, President Eisenhower's small den at the farm. They were mistakenly under the impression that Ike had gone back downtown. So 12:45 became 1, and 1 became 1:15, and 1:15 became 1:30, and all of a sudden, the office door crashes open. The general appears. His lips were moving, but David was so paralyzed with fear that he could only process 3 words: "You are fired." Well, Ike and David had a golf game scheduled for that afternoon. At 4:15, the general's black Chrysler Imperial grinds up to the door. Ike is at the wheel. Dave gets in the car. They go over to Gettysburg Country Club. They play the first hole in total silence. They play the second hole in total silence. On the 3rd hole, near the green, putting green, the general rehired Dave, illustrating Alexander Pope's maxim, to err is human, to forgive divine. Last lesson on life from Ike: face life with courage. I don't think Dwight Eisenhower was afraid of much in life, and that's perhaps why he was so formidable and sometimes unapproachable. But that doesn't mean that Ike, like the rest of us, didn't wonder and reflect upon that great unknown of life, namely death. And it's the way that Eisenhower met his death that personifies to me the last lesson I want to share with you, which is courage. It was election year, 1968, and Dwight Eisenhower lay at Walter Reed Army Hospital. He had suffered 7 heart attacks. The last one following the speech he made from his hospital room when he exhorted the Republican convention to nominate Richard Nixon. Between campaign stops, David and I tried to visit his grandfather as often as we could. And I will never forget the evening that we came into his hospital room. We were a little bit late arriving at the hospital because our plane had been delayed, and the nurses told us that the general was quite anxious for us to get there. And when we went through those double doors into the presidential suite, we saw that the nurses had propped General Eisenhower up on the bed, in the bed a little bit with some pillows. And he was so thin and so frail, and that the stark white of the sheets made his mesmerizing blue eyes seem even bluer. And the moment he spotted us, he whipped open that hospital gown. And there, on the heart monitors attached to his chest, he had stuck a Nixon sticker and an Agnew sticker. He had spirit and courage to the very end. In the Eisenhower family graveyard in Elizabethville, Pennsylvania, not far from the Gettysburg farm where Ike and Mamie spent their retirement years, there's a still visible inscription on an 1874 tombstone of Ike's 37-year-old aunt, Lydia Eisenhower. It reads, "I'm going home to glory, a golden crown to wear. Oh, meet me over there." Dwight D. Eisenhower did go home to glory in every sense of the word. And it was a privilege for me to help David tell his story. And it's a privilege to be back in Yorba Linda with so many wonderful friends. Thank you.
Julie, thank you. As I say, we've been arguing about which stories to tell and so forth. She told a lot of them. Ed Nixon, Ron Walker, Sandy Quinn, Ben and Carl, thanks for having us here today. I'll give you some background on this book. Going Home to Glory is the title of the book proposal that we circulated to New York publishers in the summer of 1976. Julie and I had moved to New York from Washington that summer, and Ben Stein, our host today, encouraged us to start considering some publishing interest that he had encountered about us. And so we circulated this proposal entitled Going Home to Glory, and we did so at Ben's suggestion. Now, we were seeing a lot of Ben in those days, both in New York and in Washington, when he was a young editorial writer for the Wall Street Journal, one of the youngest in their history, one of the best. He authored an article that made a big impression on us. I don't know if Ben remembers this, but we do. It was an article entitled Bunkhouse Logic. And while I do not remember the particulars of this article, the gist of it went sort of as follows. You can't achieve or win anything in life unless you are at the table. Now there are other ways of phrasing the moral of this article. It means don't step back from challenges and opportunities, or if you do, don't bother others talking about it. Don't talk about it, do it. Do it, of course, when it is possible for you to do this. I doubt there are very many people out there with Ben Stein's ability to live a life of bunkhouse logic. The versatility of this man, his genius for writing fiction and nonfiction, about society, about economics, about grand strategy. We can't all go out and pursue ideas in quite the way Ben has. But I think the bunkhouse logic was very important in our approach here. It was a goad. It was a goad to set for yourself the task of doing that which sooner or later simply has to be done. Ben gave us encouragement. Well, we've gotten a lot of encouragement along the way. One of the ways that this book opens, Going Home to Glory, is I set myself as a young person. I'm literally becoming a teenager in the opening page of this book, but I digress to the age of 10, which is when a couple things happened. First, I'm admitted to the family business, which is our farm at Gettysburg. Second, I receive a family Bible and record the deaths, things like this. Third, I get an accordion folder for the short stories that I plan to write. That year, I always wanted to be a novelist. Now, thanks to the record of presidential records keeping, and we're here at the Nixon Library and Foundation with a fabulous collection, probably the greatest collection on a presidency and so forth. Well, there are similar records in Abilene, Kansas. Thanks to that, I am one of the few published authors in America that can actually produce a copy of the first novel I ever wrote. This is when I'm 10 years old. I'm in the White House. I had a cousin who came east from Chicago in the summer of 1957 by the name of Janet Thompson. She made a huge impression on me, and so I wrote a novel in the summer of 1958 entitled Janet Stay. And according to the Ann Whitman records, Ann Whitman was Dwight Eisenhower's secretary. She sat in the Oval Office, in the office adjoining the Oval Office where the President's secretary sits today. She notes that on July 15th, David, age 10, that's me, came in bearing the manuscript of this short story. And I walked up to the President's secretary and I said, please type this up. And so she went to work and typed up a manuscript of Janet Stay, and as it turns out, July 15, 1958 was a great day to have a copy, a printed copy of your first novel on hand. We walked over to a Xerox machine and ran off a number of copies, in fact, because Marines were landing in Lebanon that morning. And so you get a picture in the west wing of the White House of the cabinet meeting and recessing, the National Security Council meeting and recessing. So we put Janet Stay on sale for 15 cents a copy outside the Oval Office and sold a first printing in about 25 minutes. And I got the thing that is precious and there's no substitute for it, and that was encouragement. I had two heroes as a boy. In fact, there's a major book out on one of them now, and that was Mickey Mantle and Richard Nixon. I thought that I was certain that Richard Nixon would succeed my grandfather in 1960. I was looking forward to that. I was interested in every aspect of it. This is the first time, July 15th, 1958, that I meet him. He walks up to me in a gray suit. He says, what is this? And I said, this is my first book. And he says, how much does it cost? And I said, 15 cents. He didn't have the 15 cents, but an aide reached for it. 2 days later, I get a letter from the Vice President of the United States saying, Dear David, last night after dinner, the family gathered in the living room to read Janet Stay. Mrs. Nixon and the girls all agree that you're one of our very favorite authors. Now, aside from ambition, there were other reasons to do this book, beginning with the subject matter. I think that the subject matter, which is a president in retirement, has been shortchanged. If you think about it, the topic of the post-presidency ought to be one that a lot of writers take up. One of the best books that Julie and I have read in recent years is Candace Millard's River of Doubt, which is done about the restless Theodore Roosevelt, who worked off the shock of his defeat in 1912 by hazarding an exploration of uncharted regions of the Amazon River Basin, almost dying in the process. You know, this is a recurring story in American national politics, and I think it is a significant one, and this is the separation of a national leader from actual power. This is something that occurs in accordance with law, beginning with Dwight Eisenhower, who is the first president to be term limited under the operation of the 22nd Amendment. If you think about it, this is an interesting topic. Powerful, charismatic individuals laid down the mantle of the presidency who in most places in the world would rule perpetually. They are obliged under our system to set a democratic example here at home and to fashion a sort of new constitutional order. And I think that there is a lot of drama in that. I also think that it is possible that as a president surrenders power, to know this individual far better, because the layers of officialdom and staff are being peeled away, and what is left is the character of the individual who has made this impact on history. In going home to glory, Dwight Eisenhower is not undertaking Theodore Roosevelt's journey of doubt in quite the same way, but he probably had plenty to doubt as he left Washington in 1961 The defeat of the Republicans in 1960 came as a very unpleasant surprise. Dwight Eisenhower had few illusions of what the defeat in 1960 meant for his political legacy and for the Republican Party. It was not quite as crushing or as direct as TR's defeat in 1912, but in many ways you could argue that it was more insidious because the setback to the Eisenhower presidency then was unacknowledged. They could get away with not really acknowledging it, and yet this was a very real thing, and it drove him forward as a former president. He did not navigate a river of doubt in this period either, because he was older man than Teddy Roosevelt was in 1913 and 14, and he was otherworldly. As Going Home to Glory opens at the very start, he is a president. By the spring of 1961, he is a general. He reemerges in partisan politics in 1962, and I narrate that. But truly throughout this book, he becomes granddad, and he becomes a farmer, and he becomes my boss, and he becomes my neighbor. And spiritually, what he's doing is he's moving back in time. Spiritually, he becomes a cadet, and he returns to his origins in Abilene. And as he does that, my sisters and I are growing up. He grows old in this book, and we grow up. We worked for him. Julie told that story also about my adventure in 1963. If you ever get to the Eisenhower Farms, just keep this in mind. You get to the Eisenhower Farms, admire the fences. I painted the fences 5 times. So I painted fences, and yes, I did overstay that welcome. I played golf with them a lot, and we tell a lot of golf stories, or I tell a lot of golf stories in this. He was an hilarious golfer. He had a huge temper, so forth. He did not, I don't think, fully appreciate the effect of his temper on others. However, his most I would say outspoken rounds were often some of his best and his most and so forth. He was somebody who took golf and everything very, very seriously. I know him, and we describe him in this book as a painter, as a hunter, as a farmer, as a former baseball player. In fact, one of the stories that I enjoyed recreating was one that we encountered out here in California, and that was Julie's dad and I went to the Big A a number of times. A fellow that we got to know out there was Red Patterson, who was former director of public relations for the California Angels. He told me about accompanying General Eisenhower to the Polo Grounds in 1947. I think he said it's the Polo Grounds, and confronting him with evidence that organized baseball had, that Dwight Eisenhower had played professional baseball in 1909 and 1910 in a league based in Kansas under the alias of Wilson. And Patterson said, General, will you illuminate, we have, according to our records, there were 2 Wilsons in that league. Which one were you? And he said, the one that could hit. So he's a ball player, he was a golfer, and gradually, as he became more confined, and as his health failed, he becomes not only all of these things, a grandfather or whatever, he becomes a friend. And it is in this era that I believe that Dwight Eisenhower's character really comes through. There are other reasons to look at the 1960s as well. Early to the middle 1960s is the hour before daylight for the Republican Party. When Eisenhower leaves office in 1961, there was a feeling, and my grandfather acknowledges this in the papers, feeling among politicians and pundits in Washington that the Eisenhower presidency had been a complete anomaly. He would live in Going Home to Glory to see Richard Nixon elected in November of 1968, and he would die knowing that he was not an anomaly, that he was a first, not the only Republican president in a line of Republican presidencies that would dominate the White House for the next 40 and 50 years. The early 1960s is an intense phase of the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis is indeed perhaps the most dangerous moment of the Cold War, and I show here how presidents and Dwight Eisenhower and so forth rallied to President Kennedy's request for bipartisan support in that period. With its end, we find ourselves segueing into changing times, a tremendous move in civil rights, as well as the rise of conservatism, which segues into the Vietnam War. And as we segue into the Vietnam War, suddenly this question of Dwight Eisenhower's Republican Party activities and his ambitions for the Republican Party, the future of Richard Nixon begins to merge. This is the point at which Julie and I meet, and our stories begin to merge, and this entire story comes together. A story told in part here in Yorba Linda, a story told in part in Abilene, and a story that exists in our minds. I want to second Julie's observation about how special it is to be here in Yorba Linda at the Nixon Birthplace and Library Foundation. I think of the friends that we have spent time with today. I look back on the dedication of this institution 20 years ago, and I remember it was almost an hilarious event because everybody who had been veterans of the New Hampshire campaign and so forth, we got together for one more event, one more rally, and reminded ourselves of what a wonderful thing we were all part of. The supporters of the Nixon Library and Birthplace Foundation have been parts of Nixon campaigns, or they're related to people who have. I think all of us who had anything to do with it would not trade those years for anything. So we have a lot in common, including important parts of this story. We have these things in common. I think of the accident or the fate that drew Julie and me together at Smith and Amherst in the fall of 1966. She's right, I was not going to call on her. I was in a bus riding from Springfield to Amherst. I overheard somebody in the front seat saying, did you hear that Ike's grandson is at Amherst and Nixon's daughter is over in Smith? Wait till we get them together. You know, there's going to be some sort of funny thing. I did get up the nerve. My grandmother insisted. I called on her. Julie is right. I forgot my money on the cab, that I'd spent all my money on the cab, so she paid the first time. I kept getting up the nerve to go back. I realized that we had so much in common. And I realized, and it was really through Julie, that an entirely new world opened up to me, and that was the world of ideas and experiences in a national campaign. I think also, when I'm here today, of this place and an amazing association that I drew. I'm looking back to the first time that I visited the Nixon Library and Birthplace Foundation, and this was in the late 80s. And I was with Maureen's dad, Jack Drown. Just the two of us drove out here shortly after a Nixon Foundation had acquired this site with the idea of creating the institution that is here now. And we walked through the Nixon birthplace, and I was stunned. I had an experience that absolutely knocked me out, and that was I realized that I was walking through a replica, almost a perfect replica, of the Dwight D. Eisenhower boyhood home. It was the same building, the same furnishings, the same brothers, the same personalities of mother and father. I'd always thought of Richard Nixon and Dwight Eisenhower as distinct individuals, but it was then I came to appreciate what similar American stories they represented, what similar imaginings which were captured in poetry by Richard Nixon, who described the sound of trains at night leading to the wider worlds beyond. I also want to say how special it is to be in this East Room today. You know what? It's better than the actual East Room as far as I'm concerned. This is a creation made possible by Catherine Locher. It has been the scene of so many great events which we follow and we are very proud of as members of the family, including the special one that we are having today on Veterans Day. And I want to thank you on behalf of our family, the Eisenhowers, for dedicating this day to the memory of Dwight Eisenhower. November 11th, when I was growing up, was called Armistice Day. It was actually a different celebration, but I think the idea is the same, and that is we set aside a day to acknowledge our history and to try to understand our history better, to admire the qualities of our veterans, and to acknowledge the debt that we all owe them for defending freedom both at home and abroad in our long and glorious history. Veteran themes run throughout Going Home to Glory. My grandfather was somebody who was very conscious of the importance of appreciating the sacrifices of American GIs, particularly the ones that fought overseas in the 20th century, and American wars were fought overseas. in the 20th century. In Going Home to Glory, we're in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Granddad's choice in retirement was to associate himself with the story of that great battle. And so I grew up surrounded by the history of armed conflict in America and the great story of the American Civil War. It comes up in correspondence. We reproduce a lot of correspondence between me and my grandfather, mostly letters that he wrote to me. Julie quoted from one, actually to quote elsewhere in that same letter. I was talking to Hugh Hewitt, who is a wonderful guy, and he's been long involved in the Nixon Library. I was talking to Hewitt on the radio the other day, and he mentioned Veterans Day, and the first thing that came to mind was a admonition from Dwight Eisenhower to me on September 26th, 1962. He begins in handwriting scrawl, and he says, the date above does not mean anything to you because you were a young man, but this is the date of the opening of the Meuse-Argonne Offensive of 1918, exactly 44 years from now. You are too young to appreciate the significance of this date, but it is important for you to do so, and you will do so in time. I believe that I did so in time. A final note that we would say about this book that we all have in common, I would say, is that this is a family story. Politics, and my grandfather was involved in politics in the 1960s, so to a degree it's about politics, but it is really a family story. Julie and I had an interview about it not long ago in our home, and the reporter from the Philadelphia Inquirer showed up, and he was bearing the copy of a book that he and his brothers and sisters had written about their grandfather. And it was in that moment, I think, that I recognized anew that I think that it is human nature. People need to make a record of the people who are special in their lives, perhaps a patriarch, perhaps a great woman, and so forth. And this story of the generations is something that gives people an awful lot to say. We had all of this on our mind, and we wanted to say it back in 1976, and so we finally found a way to see it. There is no effort in Going Home to Glory to alter the image of the historical figure who was a commander in the European front in 1944, 1945, or his image as presidency, or to burnish in any way, at least in this volume. I think the record of progress in the 1950s, and it was remarkable, in civil rights, space, the creation of a national highway program, and so forth. It is instead to expand understanding of him, to make a record of the days that we feel he should be remembered for as well. The days in Gettysburg where it was possible to know him, to receive his advice and his tips for healthy living, to receive his guidance and support, to receive his many gifts in the form of time and attention, and above all, to observe the example he set of serenity, of religious faith, of his frank acceptance of his limitations and infirmities, by his optimism, his love for others, and his ability to shoulder responsibility, in his profound faith in America's future. And so we made a record of it, and the record of it and publication of it is a chance for a reunion. Ben has published 30-odd books. Ben, you know there is an easier way to have reunions, but there could not be a more meaningful way to have a reunion. Today is very meaningful. We have returned to a site that has inspired us at every step along the way, and we are glad to have this opportunity to present Going Home to Glory. Thank you.
Now we've got time for a couple questions. If you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand, and I'll come by with the microphone.
We'd love to answer questions.
Somebody have a question? If you have a question, just go ahead and raise your hand, and I'll come by with the mic. You have any questions? Do you want to ask a question?
Jack.
I just have a story, not a question.
Okay.
I happened to be with President Nixon. I was with President Nixon as his military aide on the day President Eisenhower died, and we zoomed up to Walter Reed Hospital.
Right.
And he went along. I didn't go in with him, but he went into the suite, came out of the suite in tears, sobbing. I had never seen him cry again for the next many, many years until Mrs. Nixon died. It was a very significant friendship.
That was Jack Brennan, who was my dad's military Marine aide in the White House, served his country with great distinction, and then after the resignation, Jack came out and was chief of staff for my dad, and I remember my father crying too when
I was going to say something, you know, that's the Eisenhower-Nixon relationship is actually of interest to historians in a big way. In fact, Julie and I have been talking with a man who is actually going to base a book on that. And the scenes that you're talking about, Jack, are ones that I remember. It's my answer to everybody. Not only, you know, there was a clash between the two that one might expect. One of the relationships we cover in Going Home to Glory is a clash between Dwight Eisenhower and Douglas MacArthur. And the reason they clashed is that Eisenhower and MacArthur, though serving together at an earlier point in their career, could not have recognized that MacArthur had the stuff of a commander of an entire war front in World War II, and so did Eisenhower. It's not surprising that these people had differences of opinion. In Dwight Eisenhower, you have a two-term president. Richard Nixon, two-term president, elected on his own power. It's amazing that these people did not clash more than they did. And what stands out in my mind is the warmth between the two in the points in common. And I'm not just talking mystically about a birthplace over here, which in every respect is a replica of the Eisenhower birthplace, but I'm also talking about a shared American experience, the way they crossed America. The groups from Europe that were forebearers, they just intersect one point after another. We're not quite cousins, we don't think. But we're...
my cousin Maureen is doing a genealogy, we'll find out.
Yeah, we got along real well, you know, when we first, kind of immediately.
David and Julie, oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, Ben, go ahead.
You are both historians. You both observed the world at large and the big picture. Is there any hope in Afghanistan? Is there any hope of a satisfactory resolution of that situation?
Resolution of what?
Of the situation in Afghanistan.
Hot potato.
No.
You know, to be honest,
I'm going to say this my way. It goes with General Ike. His ways of doing things over during World War II, I would not be here looking at you.
all right.
Great.
Thank you. Yeah. I think there is something, you know, in principle, I think that people do not want to be converted at the point of a bayonet. In principle, they resist the use of force. In principle, I think that our intervention in Afghanistan and Iraq are very troubled. By the same token, you look back over 100 years, you look at events in Iraq today, what has not happened since the end of our combat involvement in Iraq was announced several months ago, and so forth, and one wonders. You know, Dwight Eisenhower really believed that the United States had a tremendous amount to share and an obligation to share it with the world, and he saw the example of America make such a difference, as did Julie's dad. I think they will both be known, by the way, as people who made a great deal of difference in America's relations with the world. Principally foreign policy presidencies, that's another thing that Eisenhower and Nixon have in common. I don't think that, I think that Afghanistan in 1959 and 60, as Dwight Eisenhower said, existed, quote, at the sufferance of Nikita Khrushchev. This would have been a problematical theater to invest troops, but the Soviet Union is gone. The United States has made a great difference in the way it's intervened around the world, and it could well be that we may make a difference here. I think it's going well. I think it can be sustained a long time. I think that the Afghans are not going to give us the satisfaction of saying that we have converted to your point of view in every particular. They will never give us that satisfaction. Karzai's made that very clear. But I think that the intervention will, over time, prove to make the world safer. It was yeah. And do you want to add to that?
Yeah. David and Julie, in my 4 years with Jack at the White House, I did a lot of funerals. The very first funeral I was asked to do was President Dwight D. Eisenhower for your father. And it was a spectacular at the National Cathedral, and it was one of those moments that I'll never forget.
Great.
Ron, thank you. And that's exactly where this book ends. That was my 21st birthday, March 31, 1968. 1969. I was 21 on that day. And so this is the graph, this is the trajectory of this book. Suddenly, Dwight Eisenhower is coming home to Gettysburg. As a former president, he'll become a general, become a grandfather, become a farmer, and so forth. And my sisters and I are growing up. And literally, we came of age that day. This is, but the story that comes through here is what it was like to grow up around a figure like this. I've been asked this question all my life, so here's a unified answer. What was it like? But above all, to appreciate the character of this individual who made such a difference. What kind of person was that? And it really came through in the years where it was possible to know him. And the end, Ron, exactly where you and Jack Brennan and all of us got together at Walter Reed on March 28th through March 31st, 1969.
And our last question.
I love the book, and the question I have is, when you went off to high school, your grandfather wrote you a letter because Sergeant Mooney had indicated that he wanted his grandfather to give you possibly a portrait of you to bring to college. What was your decision?
Yeah, a painting of my granddad or Sergeant Mooney to hang in my room at college. He was always giving me little DDE pins that he got, and Ike ties. And he's giving me these things to give to girls, to impress the girls, and so forth. And this comes through all over. And looking back over the correspondence, you know, my first reaction was I kind of cringed a little bit because I remember not passing these things along and being a little embarrassed by the suggestion. But then I thought, you know, we're grandparents, and he just wanted us to be proud of him, and we want our grandchildren to be proud of us. So I thought that was, so I think he had the satisfaction of knowing that I carried his name very proudly. Now all these years later, in the way that people assemble family histories, I think we express our appreciation to him. And here we are. Julie has done this for her family as well in Pat Nixon, acknowledging the people to whom we owe a great debt and who we admire going forward in our lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please, thank you both for coming. We know, and many of you in the audience know, that the reason we get great speakers is not the lavish gifts that we give, it's not the honorarium, it's not the cash, it's these wonderful items that come from our museum store. And today, it's a 2010 official White House Christmas ornament.
Beautiful.
They are, of course,
Beautiful.
available in the shop as...
Beautiful.
Isn't that nice? As is.
Do you want me to wear this at Penn?
He just about took that mug under the podium. You have to sign up. We already remember. Ladies and gentlemen, they will be in the lobby in just 2 minutes, signing copies of Going Home to Glory, which we are selling in the gift shop. Please get the book and come join us.
No.